And we did ask people to let us know if they weren't going to make it. And the problem, of course, for you guys is that you'll now be expected to buy more books. I mean, there must be somebody that needs Darren McGarvey's book. Certainly after reading it, I think lots of people need to read this book. Hugely impressed by it. Poverty Safari got the Orwell Prize, got loads of attention. This is a very different book, and I think it's a book of real substance. And even when Darren's dealing with issues that you're aware of, whether it's the quality of politicians that we've got, a lot of which echoes Isabel Hartman's book, and Why Do We Get the Wrong Politicians, he does it in a way that's detailed, it's got depth, it's got substance, it's got analysis. It's remarkable because it transcends the personal element that you get in Poverty Safari. There's lots of personal stuff in it, there's lots of comments that come from Darren's lived experience, there's lots of emphasis on lived experience, but as a combination of that and a classic piece of journalism, it really is a book that's worth reading, and it's so timely. The analysis that he does in the latter part of the book, and I'm saying all this now because we're going to focus the questions mainly on education and issues around equality and so on and so forth, and creativity. But the analysis is so opposite in terms of what's happening right now, in terms of the position of the right and the left. And Darren's chapter on the left in the latter part of the book is just a brilliant prism to look at the Labour Party conference just past and the positions that have been adopted by Starmer and others. It's a really sound analysis, but it's constructive and balanced. And for all the comments that people make about the grittiness of it and the challenging of it, that's not the thing that comes through. It's a measured book that's infused by passion, and you'll gather I'm just so enthusiastic about it as I read, and I do read a lot. I mean, I've read other books as well, so I mean, I need to just put it out there, but it's not just like the only book I've read because I have to speak to them or anything like that, you know. Just absolutely loved it, and I even paid for it. Yeah, I know, I'm not saying it's full price, but so absolutely delighted to welcome Darren for the creative conversation. And what we're planning to do with this is he needs to get away. He's got a gig on tonight in Glasgow. He's got a rehearsal to do for that. You would have thought he would have been better prepared, like, but he's got a rehearsal to do for that tonight. So he needs to be in a train at 6 o'clock. So we'll take a bit of time. I've got basically 4 questions that I want to ask. And then what I was hoping to do would be to just throw it open to yourselves. I'll do the roving mic, because that's the kind of subservient creep I am. And that's why we've been so successful in getting people for these conversations at the levels to which I'm prepared to go in abasing myself, just to persuade people to turn up. So, without any further ado, or as my good friend Chris Kilkenny would say, talking shite for money on my part. Let's start off. Darren, for anybody who shamefully is here and hasn't read your book, can you give us just a kind of summary, if you like, of what the main themes of it are, what the main points of it are?
Sure, and thanks. That was just such a lovely, delicate introduction. Thanks for that. It was nice to hear somebody who's obviously read the book, thought about it, you know, because a lot of the stuff that you said was the way that I tried to write it, and you're never quite sure if the book you tried to write actually exists, if it just exists in your mind, so thank you. The book, I mean, I guess if you were just going for the kind of concise elevator pitch, the book is about what happens when a society is so divided by inequality that ultimately it puts into positions of power and influence people who are unrepresentative of far too many people. This is particularly true of politics and business and culture and obviously elite education. And how do you reconcile that? How do you do something about it? Because we have a structure in this country where it's very hard to interject in the conversations and the consensus beyond turning up in the traditional way to place your vote or a ballot, and then you wait another 5 years, you have a few more crises, and then you get another couple of terrible options, and then you go back and you do it again. So really the book is a kind of analysis of that, but a call to arms for anybody who maybe considered themselves a bit of a pragmatist or a bit of a centrist or a bit of a moderate, that the time might be coming soon when you have to be willing to put more on the line than your opinion on Twitter.
Yeah, and I think lots of the things that you've said about that are hugely important. One of the things you talk about in the book, and this wasn't one of the prepared questions, but just arising from what you're saying, is the importance of getting back to this idea of class. Because one of the things you talk about is not just that fragmentation between the rulers. There's a guy, Perlman, has a wonderful book, the donor of which is in the audience tonight. He's got a brilliant book, and he talks about the boardroom Jacobins. He talks about how those in power and those with wealth have learned to come together as a class at the very time when, if you like, the working class is becoming more and more fragmented by disrupted politics, by identity politics, by a whole assault on the whole concept of class. And a lot of what you're doing in the book, I think, is re-establishing that idea of unity, commonality and class.
Absolutely, and just kind of, I think, a boot camp about what class is, because it's been a solid 30-40 years where there has been, and I think you can evidence this strongly, a pretty concerted attempt from both sides of the political spectrum to really flush the language of class out of our lexicon politically. So now they talk about working people, because they don't want to say working class, because if you identify one class, you then can identify all classes, and they don't want to do that because that is for them politically difficult to navigate. So the first chapter in the book, it really is just putting that to bed straight away. This is not a book for people who still think that class isn't an issue, or who don't think that there's evidence for the existence of class. It just sort of says, you're no longer welcome in a discussion. We can't take you seriously. You're profoundly unserious. And then the book proceeds on that basis. So setting the precepts pretty early. And also I thought it would be good in the first instance of the book to come out quite combatively, to let the reader know, if they'd read the first book, that tonally things are a bit different this time, and that it's a reflection of how we are now, rather than me reminiscing on what poverty was like when I was a kid 30 years ago. And so, as you noted, the book tonally shifts a lot, but because when you're trying to write a book that's politically quite challenging, where you're trying to braid together lots of different ideas and then also come from a place of integrity, you've got to be kind of emotionally intelligent about how you structure a book, as well as laying out an argument methodically. There's lots of things to be considered. I mean, when you're planning a lesson, it's not just here is the best way for the knowledge to be dispensed. You're also thinking, what time of day is it? What part of the week is it? What level is this class at? How is the wee guy who's a bit disruptive going to take this part of the thing? And so you're thinking about all of that, or you should be, I hope. I mean, I certainly remember my teachers taking these things into consideration. And so it's an immense challenge always trying to bring it back to class when you're also caught up in all of that stuff, but it's such a salient issue just now. I think that it really needs to be front and centre.
And you do transfer that whole set of concepts and arguments, if you like, so well, in my view, into the context of education. You've got a chapter on education relatively early in the book. You look at the SQE scandal from a couple of years back. You look at the role of the algorithm. You're very sharp, I think, on the whole idea of closing the attainment gap and what that actually means in reality. Do you want to expand on that, Darren, for people, again, that haven't read the book?
No problem. Maybe this will be the hook for you. The attainment gap, when it's discussed politically, it suggests that it's something that the politicians are working hard to close. But what we have to understand is that any gap, whether it's a housing gap, whether it's an income gap, a labour market gap, or a gap in education, which is there's some sort of differential in outcomes between social classes. Politicians don't get in power for closing those things. Politicians get in power for maintaining those things, because it's those gaps that allow the more electorally lucrative sections of the population to continue to enjoy the privileges that are structural, that are ensured to them. And so in education, what we see is a lot of rhetoric about closing the attainment gap, but actually we need an attainment gap. We needed an attainment gap from the inception of universal education, because the working classes were supposed to forsake the privileges of a liberal education and fit themselves to particularly difficult, arduous, repetitive tasks to power the Industrial Revolution. So they required a basic education, a basic level of literacy, and the liberal educations, you know, they went to the middle and upper classes. And really what we see now, the attainment gap as it's been called, it's really just that echo of that original intention. So there has been great advances in, obviously, state education, but it's still really kind of wedded to that basic concept. And so if you have a kid from a middle class, upper middle class background, and a kid from a poorer background, and you could have some way of measuring their kind of base levels of competence, even if you found that the working class kid was brighter, right, was more academically brilliant, was more enthusiastic, had a better attitude than the other kid, just by virtue of the pipelines that run through the two-tier education system, the working class kid is going to end up in a less well-paying job, is going to struggle more to meet their basic needs. They're going to have a shorter lifespan, they're going to have more chance of police involvement, they're going to have more chance of coming into contact with the criminal justice system, more chance of suffering bereavement, more chance of being around addiction, crime and drugs. And so it's all of those other contextual factors often that are holding people back. And so when any politician talks about closing the attainment gap and they don't talk about all that other stuff, they're not interested in closing the attainment gap. What they're interested in is cooking the books until the next election, because then that's when they can say whatever it is they're going to say, or forget that they said they were going to say something because it didn't go so well.
I think it's particularly interesting because in education, if you go back 10 years, the big driving force was getting it right for every child, which was encouraging an integrated attack on poverty and disadvantage by bringing together a range of services. And interestingly to me, but my experience when I worked in Stirling was that we attempted regeneration in one specific area in the town, where we addressed housing, we addressed employment, we addressed culture, we addressed education. We brought in new build, but the idea was to try and do everything. And the area was Raploch, and the kind of surviving marker for it is the Big Noise Orchestra, which loads of people are now familiar with. That's a kind of radical transformation that took place because we talked about whole-scale regeneration. And as you say, we've moved that on to simply a discussion about raising attainment.
Yeah, and it's kind of, we're at a point now where poverty and inequality has been broken down into subgenres because it's understood that it's easier to manage if you take a little specific slice of the pie and say, right, okay, this is to deal with food poverty, these resources are to deal with fuel poverty, that's to deal with educational inequality. But actually, the real prize is for the people who can reframe it all as part of one reservoir of inequity that is contaminating every single area. And I think that's why people are interested in Mick Lynch, because he's not just saying, I'm fighting for my workers, he's saying, I'm also fighting for you, because there's a bigger story here about this country is actually set up for the benefit of people who already have enough. And so the casualties in that, right? The casualties in that, and the innocent victims in that are the kids who are too young to be criminally culpable for anything. They're too young to know politics, they're too young to take responsibility, too young to make better lifestyle choices, all the things that you might get away with pinning on an adult who comes from poverty. And there are rising numbers of children in poverty, therefore there are rising numbers of children who are becoming educationally excluded, either triaged in parallel educational institutions which are similarly under-resourced relative to the complicated learning needs and educational cultures which present in those schools for children that are really troubled and really traumatised. And where do they end up? They end up in secure units, they end up in young offenders institutions, and they end up in prison. And I'm not saying all of them do, but far too many of them do. And that is the real cost of that kind of educational apartheid. You're talking about, it's not like a victimless inequity. You're talking about death and despair and dysfunction. Any homeless person you see, any kid in prison, their social exclusion began in a classroom because a teacher had to make a choice. Am I going to devote all my time and resources to trying to deal with your complex behavioural, emotional, psychological needs at the expense of these 30 other pupils? Or am I going to have to send you to the head teacher who then will send them on to another educational institution or suspend them or exclude them in some way? And I'm not saying that's an easy ethical dilemma, but all the conversation around closing the attainment gap doesn't even make any contact with that reality, and therefore it's just about trying to keep, as I say, electorally lucrative parents on side. Who cares about all those other parents?
Yeah, I think there's two interesting things that I want to come back to in that. And one of them is about you, because one of the most striking things about you is how uncomfortable you are about who you are now. There's a lot of that in the book. And the show that you did not this year, but last year at the Edinburgh Festival, was very much about that conflict between, if you like, the Loki character on the one hand and Darren McGarvey, the Orwell Prize winner, on the other. And one of the things that struck me about that was it speaks to the real depth of social mobility as a challenge. Because Darren McGarvey's done really well. You know, Loki's still happening. Well, it's here, he was flogging boots for him, you know. And there's a boy in a linen suit buttling down to you every time. Right, I mean, talk us through a bit about what that kind of personal challenge of social mobility feels like for you.
Well, if you're lucky enough to experience social mobility, which obviously that is a phenomenon which is increasingly narrowly distributed, but sometimes you might be lucky enough. I mean, for me, it was a combination of circumstances. It wasn't just hard work. There was a bit of luck involved, and possibly some karma, good karma getting cashed in. But no one talks about the cost of social mobility to you. The whole idea of our society seems to be, it creates these incentives for us to get up, take our skills, take our experience, take our wealth away from where we grew up and go somewhere else, where the real people live, where the successful people live. And so you just have like middle class ghettos full of people talking about how they need another driveway or something, right? And people do that because they develop problems and they develop experiences relative to their success that they get embarrassed to talk about around people who have real problems, right? So if your main problem that day is, oh, you know, my £2,000 mortgage is going to go up because of all this crisis, you know, and I feel really stressed about that because it might look on paper that I've got a lot of money, but with a lot of money you expand all your outgoings, so you're always experiencing financial insecurity relative to what you have, what you think you should have, and what you're going to lose, and that's why all these billionaires don't stop working. And so you don't learn that until you cross over the other side of the tracks. And so I've got this kind of conflict where I still have a clear view into the communities that I grew up in. I mean, I still live in a scheme. I judge a scheme by, is there a Greggs? Right? So I don't care how much your house was. If there's a Greggs within half a mile of your house, you live in a scheme and the Greggs is what's suppressing your house price. Now, when you go
it's worth it for the sausage roll.
When you go back to your life, as you knew it, it can become difficult to not to relate to people, but to even just converse with people, because you have to take a minute to adjust to the climate. So you're just having a normal conversation, you're like, what you been up to? And the person's like, I was doing the brewing, and I'm supposed to be getting my pip and I never got it, and now I'm feeling suicidal, or I was back in the jail, and then they go like that to you. What have you been up to? You know what I mean?
I was doing that
just like, nothing, just ways. You know what I mean? But I might have been that day doing a keynote somewhere, filming a TV series, just planning cool things that I'm lucky enough to get to do. And so there's just a weird survivor's guilt that comes with it. And don't get me started on all the financial problems that arise just through making more money. That's another book. Very limited audience for it, but definitely needs to be written.
And the second thing that I wanted to come on to out of that was an awful lot of what you say in the book about the change that's required in education is systemic. What do you see as the role of individuals, like people here tonight? And interestingly, we've got a range of people here tonight. We've got colleagues from Spartans, who are a third sector organisation supporting really challenged and difficult young people. We've got colleagues from EAL Service who will be doing work, I would imagine, with increasing numbers of refugee communities, much more depressed communities than we've been in the habit of dealing with. And we've got lots of people who are teachers, both primary, secondary and beyond. As individuals, Darren, what do you think that they can do to make a difference?
It's difficult because I've got this ideological superego, this kind of angry left-wing deity that lives in my mind that's just scanning every single thought and everything that I might say, and is just disgusted by the concept of individuals because it's the collective and it's the class and it's the struggle. But I know that ideology actually crashes against the rocky shore of reality the minute you actually go into a community and try to do something or try to assume responsibility for pretty much anything, because nobody is thinking in those terms. And for me, I think partly what's made me effective, and I can only talk about my own experience, is I'm in regular contact with that reality, even though I don't necessarily have to live it anymore. And I was saying this to some trainee doctors yesterday at Glasgow University, who I think were wanting to just hear me talk about my addiction story. And then it was too good an opportunity to get into their heads early, you know, and reprogram them. And I was just saying, look, even after this event, there's nothing stopping you from going out into society and making contact with people. You know what I mean? And I don't mean like emailing them. I mean go into their community and don't try to organise them, and don't try to choreograph them, and don't try to assimilate them. Just be with them, just walk alongside them. And the thing that you start to notice is how much wisdom there is in them already. And it comes out in different ways, and it takes a wee while to adjust your kind of receiver to what they're transmitting. Because culturally, we're always subtly getting the message that people who speak with a heavy accent are somehow intellectually inferior, they're vulgar, they're dangerous, they're quick to anger. And in some cases this is obviously true. But in a lot of cases, that's just that's the palate cleanser that they're putting out there to see, you know, can this person be trusted? You know, so they put you through your paces in the start, and then once you've made it through that, then you really start to get a proper sense of people. And you'll know this through your work in schools, you'll know this from kids, how they present initially, and how they then present, and how their behaviour evolves once they feel safe in the dynamic. So that would be the thing, because obviously you set up an institution or organisation to deal with something, the more successful you are, the harder it gets to run that thing, or do that thing. And the more you get pulled away by responsibility, away from the front line, away from the grassroots, away from the thing that you were doing for in the first place. So always be looking for a way to get back there.
There's a brilliant case study of that in the book, and it's a GP. And you talk a lot about that GP and the way that she operates, and it's almost like Dr. Finlay's casebook meets the Independent Labour Party, you know, in that she engages in that very traditional way with the community, and in a sense makes a difference. I think. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, Dr. Lindsay Crawford, who actually coincidentally I was with yesterday, because she is now running part of that medics and lived experience project that I was speaking to people there, and so she believes passionately in that. And obviously she had a see the thing about going into a community with a mindset that you're going in there because in some way something needs to change. You also need to start breaking down into more manageable increments. How are you going to affect them? How are you going to persuade them? I mean, what tone do you take when you're trying to tell somebody they need to give up something, or they need to change some aspect of their behaviour, or they need to speak a certain way? The thing is, it's because the rapport doesn't exist. You have to generate the rapport, and that happens naturally just by walking alongside people for long enough. I mean, we're kind of wired for this. So if we just spend enough time around each other, we start to find out a bit more about each other, not just the literal stuff on the surface, where are you from, where do you come from, what's your experience, but also all those little subtleties of our behaviour and communication. And so then we start to intuitively understand, for example, when it would be appropriate to make light of a situation that might be quite grim, or when it might be appropriate to speak frankly when somebody is, you know, shirking around an issue. And that takes time to generate that, but the people who are most effective in any role that they do, which is frontline, are the people who either are fortunate enough to get the time or who make the time to develop that rapport in the first instance, because it's so important to get that reciprocal respect and reciprocal understanding. They need to know you and you need to know them, and ultimately it's a lot more enriching, that exchange, that interaction, because that's not just something that's ticking a box in your job, that's something that is actually giving your life a deeper meaning and a deeper purpose and changing you in a very profound way.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting to listen to, because what you're doing from a personal perspective and from effectively in this conversation from the perspective of the child, is putting yourself right at the heart of what's one of the big current educational debates, as to whether we're there to deliver something for somebody else, or whether we're there to meet the child where the child is and take them forward as best we can and do our best to help them to know themselves by giving ourselves that openness to get to know them.
Yeah, and I mean, there are many shapes an education system tooled for the 21st, 22nd century might look like, because I mean, you've got on one hand constant warnings that the nature of the labour market is changing. Now, the whole education system that we have is designed for a 20th century labour market, so that's the first big problem, the built-in obsolescence of education itself. And then the question is, if some of the subjects I studied at school were obsolete by the time I finished school, and the pace of technological change is increasing, then what are the kids learning just now in class that is of absolutely no use to them in terms of the labour market by the time they leave? And then the next thing is, how can children in school have any sense of certainty about the future when they're going home to parents who are in the labour market right now, working 2 or 3 jobs and they're still poor? So there's just something fundamentally unsynchronised about education, how it even connects with the labour market. So either you find a way to radically overhaul it so that it's more in tune, or you begin to look at education as something different, because if we're saying adults will now have to retrain multiple times to stay relevant in the labour market, then maybe that actually relieves some of the burden on education, and we can start getting in about this trauma and start getting in about some of these other things. That where education isn't just about basic competencies and you know, like literacy, numeracy, but is also maybe about something wider. Who knows? Maybe philosophically, it's something maybe we learn to think critically. Earlier on, maybe we're taught about finance. Earlier on, maybe we're taught, you know, what is a hedge fund? Maybe we should start teaching that stuff early, because it seems like that sort of stuff is quite relevant right now. And 3/4 of the population are just like hedge fund. You know, they just tune out. They have no real concept of how different a million is from a billion. They're just like, and that's partly because kids in certain schools just don't need to know that stuff, do they?
And I love it as well, because there's so much bollocks spoken about all of this, and one of the things that I talk about a lot is this idea of we need to educate children for jobs that haven't been invented yet.
Yeah.
I mean, what the flip is that?
Yeah.
Name me a job that hasn't been invented yet. You know, husky jockey. There's nobody riding huskies round Aintree. None of that's happening. You know, what does it actually mean when the biggest expanding sector is care?
Yeah.
You know? So just throwing that in. Can I move you on, Dan, just before, because I'm keen to bring people in, but I need to satisfy myself first. So that's the key thing. One of the things that I was really struck by, both in Poverty Safari and in the social distance between us, is when you talk about the work that you've done, particularly in prisons. There's a brilliant section at the start of Poverty Safari where you talk about working with young women in prisons, and there's some really, really good stuff in the social distance. And a lot of that is, well, it seems to me a lot of that is about unleashing creativity to empower and enrich people, and hopefully to give them some chance of recognising quality in themselves and taking it further. Can you say, first of all, a bit more about that, and also then, because of the nature of this conversation, take us into what you see as the role of creativity, if you like, in terms of making a difference?
Cool. Well, yeah. I mean, it was good how you kind of paralleled the chapter in the first book with the second book, because that was another wee thing that I tried to do that was quite subtle, you know, to show the other side of that gender coin in prison, and the men and the women are quite different in terms of how they behave in a prison setting. Particularly, there's big generational differences. So in a young offenders institution one morning I arrive, the boys know I'm coming. They know that I'm a rapper, and so they've already decided among themselves that one of them is going to challenge me to a rap battle in the prison. Now my dilemma in that moment is, I was not prepared for this. Also, it was my first job back at the prison after I lost my job there because of my alcoholism a couple of years previous. So I'm not just there to help them. I'm there because I'm like, right, I've got to get back in the game here, you know, work-wise. And then they come. And straight away I'm confronted by a dilemma which arises out of my intimate understanding of this whole terrain, not just the context of the prison, but the cultural context, the toxic male behaviour, how they analyse, interpret situations, and how they're always jockeying for position within their own little groups. And so if they challenge me to a rap battle, which is a very aggressive exchange, then there's a number of risks associated with that. First, there's the risk to my pride of losing. There's the risk that it might escalate in some way. I have no insight into what these guys' emotional barriers or boundaries are. And then also there's the risk of violence. And but then there's also the risk if I don't do it. Because in these communities, it's you better do that and you're a shite bag if you don't. And not being a shite bag is a premium on pretty much everyone. And this is why they're all in prison. Because they've all done something that they probably had a vague sense was none too clever, but they couldn't even confront the reality of going back to their peer group, having said, I've not battered him for saying this thing about my girlfriend, or I've not done him for not paying my money back, or whatever it might be. So actually you flip it round and you say, I have a chance to establish myself here as somebody that they can look to in a leadership role if I actually escalate this conflict, which is a high stakes thing to do. But I done it, and it worked. And it was only because my understanding of them, my understanding of rap, and my ability to make that decision in a split second. I mean, I spend about 5 minutes laying out all of the different dilemmas in that moment, but for me it was just instant. It was just, there's no way I can say no, they'll lose all respect for me. They've came here all pumped up to challenge me, so this wee guy's going to have to get ripped in front of everybody. Do you know what I mean?
Deep philosophy.
And in the moment, well, it kind of is. That's the thing when you hear some of these conversations about toxic masculinity. The men that you need to send in to deal with the toxic masculinity have to understand that language. They have to be able to speak in the language of the toxic male. They have to be able to kind of drape themselves in that for long enough to endear themselves to those groups, to establish themselves in any way, to persuade anyone to even think about reconsidering their ideas or philosophies in life. So this idea that you've got toxic men, and then what you do is you send a guy who doesn't have a criminal record and has never done anything toxic in his life and has learned all the terminology, just come across as just the absolute nicest, cleanest, wokest guy ever in the world. He's going to get chased out of there. You know, so it's like, you've got to send out somebody who's got a wee bit of history. Somebody's had to do a wee bit of work on themselves. And I think that stands across any area that you might be talking about, whether it's education, whether it's prison, and creativity. I see that as something that's inherent to everyone. The difference is we have a society that says some people don't do creative things, they do hard work, graft things. And actually, you know, all you need to do is go to a local pub on karaoke night once everybody's had a few in them to see. Everybody's creative, everybody has a creative outlet, everybody has something they want to do. I mean, I was nearly moved to tears in a pub in Portsmouth, filming one night when I went in, and a guy with, like, who could hardly breathe, constricted throat and all that, respiratory problems, got up and sang a song, and he just hit every note, and it was beautiful. And the thing is, you know, he wouldn't have had a chance in hell of getting into the Royal Conservatoire, but there'd be a bunch of people in the Conservatoire who can't sing like him, who'll end up getting into a pop band or joining an orchestra or doing something. And so he just comes into a community where singing's not the done thing unless you're pissed.
There's a brilliant conversation on Twitter today which stems from some of the discussions about this. And I had tweeted a quote from somebody in an FE college saying, "Thanks very much, it's the James McNamara, you got me an E in my higher English. All the secondary teachers who told me I couldn't sit it can get to." And the interesting follow-up to that was him coming back into the conversation saying, the thing about FE colleges is they give second chances to people who shouldn't actually need a second chance. And I think you're getting to a lot of that in terms of that particular element.
And James McInerney,
well done.
It's a funny name that, but then once I learned it, it stuck. He's written the best book on education, Class Rules, which is available on Louth Press, and it was really his clarity around the algorithm at Scandal that then started to open the issue up to me in ways that I hadn't before, because I started to see the patterns of inequality repeated in education that I had been starting to analyse everywhere else. And he's a bit different from me in terms of the tone he takes, because he's not as interested in being fair or being seen to be fair. He's not as interested in creating the emotional conditions in which someone might become likelier to be persuaded that they're wrong. He's a gung-ho, these are the facts, you're a tool for believing what you believe, get these tools away from me, and that's his, and I think you do need that diversity, you know, but he's very kind of like just laser focused in that regard. I'm not a specialist in any of these areas. I sort of defer to people like James on some of these deeper questions, but certainly I draw from a lot of other people who are working in those areas and feed that into the mill to try and come up with a more comprehensive, more general picture of the whole thing.
Yeah, and do it very well. I'm going to open it up. Questions from the audience.
Do you think schools should be filled with people who are more representative of the communities they serve? And if so, how do we go about that? Because I see kids come into school and they see teachers and they don't believe the teachers are like them. They speak a different language, different rules. Similar to what you were talking about there at prison. They no credibility. How do we have schools that serve their communities in such ways that kids feel part of it because they see themselves in the adults in the building?
Yeah, that's quite a radical idea. I mean, it's almost sort of it's like a more direct democracy. you have representative democracy where one person gets kind of anointed to represent everybody regardless, and then a direct democracy would be everybody getting involved. And I think the logistics of how you would bring a situation like that about, I don't know. But part of the picture has to be to empower working class people to get into the profession, and that involves better action on social inequality, because obviously one of the big effects of social inequality is there's a dearth of cross-pollination between social classes. It's just assumed that every working class person is just waiting to graduate to become middle class, and often they do, and it's because they dull down their accent, they wear a blazer instead of a hoodie, they learn all the tricks of the trade, and then one day they just wake up and they've got a Glasgow uni accent, and that's it. Obviously not everybody's that cunning though, and so we're leaving a lot of gains on the table, as it were, when it comes to if you had a bit more class inequality, a bit more class equality, where people who necessarily might not be middle class economically were starting with a shot or getting into a job or taking on an influential position. I mean, one of the people I covered in the book was just call centres, and the guy, the trade union rep, couldn't think of one instance where somebody for the local community who was working in the call centre had been promoted to management level. The managers were all getting bussed in, So it's just, sometimes you think there's an underclass that's there just so that middle class professionals have got something to do. A lot of the time, I think that was part of the trade-off when you Labour, to be honest. I don't think you would have voted for Tony Blair, a lot of them. If it wasn't for the fact that they get a good slice of the poverty pie, get back into their communities and sort all the scumbags out.
There's a brilliant story about training in one of the call centres in Kirkcaldy before it strangely shut, where the training mainly consisted of telling them what they could and couldn't say. So the guy had said, you can't say Ken, you can't say Niba, you can't say Abdi, you can't say Nibdi. Went through this whole list of 5 phrases, culminating with, under no circumstances can you ever say the F word. And the lassie sitting beside my daughter at the training went, well, that's my entire fucking vocabulary. And I think there's some real power in that. Questions from the audience, now that we've liberated the F word. It's open season.
On the 10th of October, the SNP conference is going to discuss raising the school starting age and introducing a kindergarten stage. And I don't know whether you know, but James McAnany, that was his first suggestion for improving in-class scores, and he's just released it on the internet free for people to read. So I just wondered what your feelings were on that suggestion.
It's a great example of how meaningful policy does not begin in politics. A lot of the best policies that we've seen from in my view, a Scottish government whose record has been very patchy, partly because of how saddled it is with all its upper middle class voters who can just change to Tory at a moment's notice. So they can't do too much to make things more equal, because that means being seen to attack the privileges of that electorally lucrative demographic. But that's an example, just like free school meals, free travel for elderly people, where a good policy's been initiated by a campaigner who's really just not given up, who's really just kept on going, irrespective of the criticism, irrespective of a lot of people not understanding what they're on about initially. And I think James, as well as obviously being a great journalist, he is a great journalist, it doesn't always come across when he's in his kind of campaign mode, especially on Twitter, but he's very diligent, and he's able to kind of hold the facts in his mind in a way that I couldn't, that I find intimidating, and he can keep going back to it. I think any suggestion that they take off him will make education better. He seems to possess a real deep understanding, as disagreeable as he can be on Twitter.
So we work at a school in Edinburgh, in the Pilton area of Edinburgh, so it's quite a deprived area. We've got a lot of really troubled young people that we work with. There's a lot of trauma, there's a lot going on. I suppose sometimes it can just feel like it's like, what can you actually do, as a teacher, what can you actually do to help these people? Was there anything that anybody could have said or done, any teacher, any professional, when you were that age, that would have made a difference to you?
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't quite fall into the category that I think you're describing. I had a lot of similar experiences to them, but I also had solid relationships in my life that offered a certain level of continuity and support and structure. Whereas the children who you see fare worst in a mainstream society, a mainstream environment, are the ones who just, all their connections are intermittent. They don't have a solid continuity, they don't have someone who they feel is always in their corner no matter what. So sometimes a teacher can become that person. It's difficult because you're kind of oscillating between this individual and collective thing again. Individually, obviously there's loads of things that we can do, but then also the collective thing is, you know, when we start hearing talks about a general strike and people start trying to organise that, there's not just a general strike because of a cost of living crisis. It's registering a pretty mass grievance with the fundamentals of this society which keep reproducing that problem for you in your job. They keep reproducing that problem for doctors in their job. They keep reproducing that problem all across the landscape, where people who got into a job to do something that they cared about deeply are demoralised and considering leaving their profession because the whole society is being run for the benefit of people who don't need you, and they don't need the doctor, and they don't need anybody else because they're all private everything. I mean, it's obscene. So when it comes to that time, then there's the individual, what can I do? But then there's when your trade union person comes round and saying, we're all going on strike. Everybody's got to go. Everybody's got to go out and just let them know enough is enough. Sorry, I got in a bit of... They keep asking me to come and speak at these trade union rallies, and I keep thinking, no, you don't want to let that cat out the bag. You don't want to let that suitcase out the tube.
Mick Lynch is like the Mogadon to your amphetamine, mate. That's how it works, mate. He's like calming everybody out. I mean, I think that question's really powerful in a sense because it gets right to the heart of that dilemma that you've talked about. And the bottom line is, you do what you can where you are with the challenges that come across your path. And if you can't blast the handholds in the rock that allow the child to climb and take their community with them, then at least show them how to get a grip. And you know, fundamentally, I think that's what you'll be doing. And it's that idea of recognising work. There's a brilliant example a colleague of mine gives, and he's going to do a creative conversation with us again later in the year. But he talks about working with challenging kids in Barnsley. And one of the things that he did was he used Kes as the book that they read because they could see themselves in the book. And then he used To Kill a Mockingbird because that challenged some of the elements in the community that needed to be challenged. It goes right back to your comment about there's a time to speak the truth and there's a time to make the link. And it's trying to make sure that when the link's made, that it's strong enough that it allows you to make the challenge. But if we don't have the link, we can't make the challenge. And that, I think, fundamentally is a lot of the point that you're making, Darren, in both books.
It's just the way the society's run, it's just now accepted that all of these lives are wasted. That's baked into the equation. It's just an externality that is just part of how we've structured our economy, and we should be saying no, you know, no, not over and over again. Because the truth is, you help that person, you do help them get on the rock face, they become a rock climber, they become an astronaut. You turn your back for 5 minutes, you turn around, there's another 5, back at square one, over and over and over and over it goes.
And just going back to your question, Stephen, one of the things I've been really struck by was we've been working on a course in trauma-informed practice.
I'm terribly sorry, David, but I'm an old lady and I'm deaf. Can you use the mic?
Sorry. We're working on a course on trauma-informed practice, and we did a cross-section through a school. And two of the most meaningful contributions that were made by the janitor and two of the pupil support assistants. And maybe we need to look at other routes into teaching that allow us to pick up on colleagues like that and give them the opportunity for development into a fuller, more professional role as well. And that creates, you know, the astronaut that spawns the other 5 as well. Last question from me, because
I'm just trying to. I'm gonna stay for 5 minutes longer and answer that question.
Right, anarchistic communism. That's not happening. Ruth.
I completely agree with what you were saying about FE, and one of the frustrations for me is I can see young people in my school who I know are going to be grand when they get to college. Should we be letting them get to college earlier? Do we need to look at when young people leave school and shift the age from 16?
A person's ready to go when they're ready to go, aren't they? So what is it about the relationship with education that's so disorientating to a certain type of person going through a certain type of experience? I think this idea of opening up the universities is instructive because you can increase accessibility to universities all you want, but it's a bit of a quantum leap going from a working class secondary school to a university campus. I mean, that leap culturally, that leap to independent learning, that leap to having to have a certain margin for error and resources around you to absorb all of the crises that are going to befall you through that time. And that's why the middle class kids stay to the end of their degree, and a lot of the working class kids, first year, some of them go, second year, some of them go, and then the other ones maybe go back later and do their third year once they've raised their kids. And so that's an example of how, on one hand, you're getting an aspect of it right in principle. You're saying these are dominated by middle class people, working class people should get an opportunity to come for a university education. But then it becomes very patchy when it's like really trying to analyse the quantum mechanics of why the working class kids fare less well. It's not just because they're not. It's not because they're not smart. It's all of those contextual factors that are pulling them back in. And they're just like a fish out of water every time they go to university. They're just like, I don't feel like I belong here. Sometimes they can't even put words to what it is. But a lot of them, if you ask them, the first few weeks in university, it's just a massive shock to the system culturally. And that's before they've even got into the workload, the independent learning and so on. Did we get a question?
We're beaming Keanu Reeves in from The Matrix, so
not
brace
a
yourself.
question. Not a question, but a comment. Perhaps we need.
Middle class people.
Can you read that?
Let me see. I'm only joking, by the way. I saw you at Connect and asked a question about education then. Oh, I remember that question. Great to hear you speak again. If they asked you, would you get on board with the Scottish Government and be an advisor? No. No. I dispense my advice from the pages of newspapers, and that's about as close as I want to get to the Scottish Government, personally.
Any more?
It's a symptom of how desperate the situation is, where people think I could be a government advisor.
Right. Here's another one. It's not a question but a comment. Perhaps we need to think a successful person is someone who is a decent human being and not necessarily a managing director or a top sportsman.
Well, yes, it is, but also be careful with that, because the government's Social Mobility Commission and their czar, Britain's strictest head teacher, has been coming out recently and saying, no, we should acknowledge all the little jobs. We should acknowledge all the little people doing the little jobs. Not everybody can be a banker, not everybody can be the Prime Minister. But not long ago, the Tories would have told you you had a poverty of aspiration if you weren't trying to do those things. So what they're now doing is flipping the script on everybody and saying, no, society is going to continue to be unequal. None of you have got a chance to get into the big jobs, so we're going to give you little badges now instead of shaming you publicly about it. So yes, of course, anybody who possesses personality that's nice and compassionate and thoughtful and conscientious, of course. But you'll be rewarded just by being well thought of. You'll be rewarded by being part of a community where you're kind of respected. Once the government start trying to get in and measure all that stuff, you know what I mean, I would be a bit worried about that. And being nice is not necessarily going to mean you're going to have the money to pay your bills. So no, we need to also make sure the system is set up so that people can actually get on materially and change the material conditions of their life, irrespective of whether they're nice people or not, because our souls deserve to make a living too, quite frankly, and that's what class solidarity is all about.
but we shouldn't be doing a mini budget. I think that's the main thing. I mean, I think we've covered a huge amount of ground tonight, Darren, and I'm grateful to you for that. I'm also conscious of trying to manage your time, so I'm going to stop at this point. Thank you for that. I mean, one of the things I think that's come out of that last part is we also need to stop hiding behind folk like you. We need to stop asking why you're not offering advice to Scottish Government, because we've got votes, we've got voices, and we've got the capacity to make the challenges that you're making. Maybe not with the loquacity, maybe not with the structure, maybe not with the thoroughness that you do in the latest book, but we've got that opportunity too. And the answer, I think, to people is that if we don't take action, we'll lose the habit of it. So regardless of how small the ripples are from the action that you take it. Because otherwise the pond remains still, and when it remains still, it becomes stagnant. And that's what we're looking at the moment, culturally, is we're looking at a situation where there's a revolving door for Prime Minister, but you need to pass and meet certain standards before you get through that revolving door. And if we witness that cycle of incompetence and sit back and wait for the Darren McGarveys of this world to do it, we're failing ourselves, we're failing our children, and we're not making the change, and we're not doing what you're asking us to do, Darren.
Yeah, and I'll just end with this. I travel around this country all the time, right? Sometimes up and down, in the space of a month, I'm up and down it multiple times. Everywhere I go, it's a room full of people who are all wanting to get something done, who want things to change, and they ask me, what should we do? And I say, go and find all the other people in all the other rooms, because see, once you realise how many of you there are, you won't feel so intimidated by the scale of the challenge. They want you to stay in your wee subgenre, they want you dealing with that wee section and that wee subgenre of this, and staying in that wee insular circular conversation thing for survival. Because the minute everybody twigs, it goes, the teachers, the doctors, the bin people, everybody, we're all pissed off, we're all fed up, and coming together. And that honestly is how you balance a country.
And as a first step, round of applause for Darren McGarvey.